The population of the world at the time of Christ was about 200 million. The diet at that time, made up of bread, milk, cheese, and butter, as well as olives, dates, grapes, figs, and such, offered little variation. The world's population showed steady expansion with only minor fluctuation during the ensuing 1,900 years, up to the level of about 1.6 billion. This shifted to a trend of rapid acceleration, however, after the beginning of the 20th century, bringing the total population to its current level of 5.8 billion. With annual increases now in the range of 90 million, it is estimated that we will see an increase to 6.1 billion by the year 2000, 8.5 billion by 2025, and 10 billion by 2050. Animal life, including humanity, is sustained and nurtured by vegetable life, which in turn depends on sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, nutrients in the soil, and other elements for its existence. All of these resources are available only in limited amounts. If we continue to increase our numbers at the current rate, it is just possible that all vegetation on the surface of the Earth will eventually be consumed to the point of extinction. A research group at the University of British Columbia in Canada has released a very interesting report claiming that 20 years or so from now, when the world's population will have swollen to 8.5 billion, 3 or 4 additional planets with the same amount of arable land as the Earth will be needed to support the lives of the human race at the same level as the average Canadian today. The bountiful abundance of our Earth is not something that can be created by human hands. If steps are not taken to bring a halt to this population increase, the world will experience repeated struggles and disputes over the available food supplies half a century from now, and economically weak countries will inevitably be faced with the threat of starvation. Right now, in 1996, the population of Asia accounts for approximately 3.5 billion of the total world's population of 5.8 billion. In other words, about 4 out of every 7 persons are Asian. Asian nations that have a particularly high population include China, with a population of 1.2 billion, and India, with 900 million. These are followed by Indonesia, with a population of 190 million, Pakistan, with 130 million, Bangladesh, with 120 million, and Japan, with 120 million. This indicates the population density of the world. The regions marked in red have a population density of 200 or more per square kilometer. It is easy to see that there are many of these regions in Asia. The major cause of population increase is a continuously high birth rate coupled with an increasingly low mortality rate. In other words, a condition of many births and low mortality. This shows the birth rate per 1,000 population in each region. We can readily observe how many regions there are in Africa and Asia with a birth rate that is higher, for example, than in the US or Europe. Another characteristic of Asia is the high level of the total fertility rate, that is, the total number of offspring born to a woman during her life. In Asia, the nations of South Asia rank highest in this respect. Poverty leads families to bear many children in order to produce many workers and to provide for old age security. While there has been a persistently high birth rate during the last 2 decades, the mortality rate has continued to drop. The major reason for this has been the lack of measures to suppress population growth, together with the decline in infant mortality. This indicates infant mortality in major Asian nations during the 30-year period from 1965 through 1995. A drop in infant mortality is evident in virtually all countries. The outcome has been a condition of many births and low mortality, and a subsequent increase in population. From 1945 to 1950, 60% of the Japanese population still lived in farming villages. No stringent population control measures had been introduced, and systems for hygiene and medical treatment were still inadequate. The birth rate and mortality rate were both high at that time. In other words, a condition of many births and many deaths. Later, agricultural production proceeded smoothly, and with the advancement of industrialization and urbanization beginning in the 1960s, steps were taken to assure the dissemination of education, improvements in the diet, and the development of facilities for hygiene and medical treatment. This ultimately resulted in a demographic transition from a condition of high births and mortality rates to high births and low mortality rates, and finally, developing into a condition of low births and mortality rates. Now, in 1996, with the expansion in advanced technology and the information revolution, the birth rate has dropped to 11 per 1,000 population. The total fertility rate has also declined to 1.43, and it is expected that the population will begin to decline in about the year 2010. Korea and Singapore, which have followed much the same pattern as Japan, have been successful in achieving industrialization, attaining a high level of education, and developing substantial facilities for medical care. Meanwhile, they are also realizing the same shift to a condition of fewer births and fewer deaths. In most of the nations of Southeast Asia, however, investments have been directed into the development of hygiene and medical treatment facilities, and efforts have only been made to realize a decrease in the mortality rate. While there have been inadequate efforts by the government to provide guidance, disseminate family planning information, and undertake population control. In India, too, the rural population accounts for some 60% of the total, and the birth rate remains at the high level of 28 per 1,000 population. The mortality rate, however, has been on the decline due to the development of public hygiene facilities and the availability of pharmaceuticals. Meanwhile, infant mortality has been reduced by half since 1950. A condition of high births and low mortality rates, such as this, is the main cause for the population increase. Currently, India's total population stands at about 900 million, making it the second largest nation in the world in population. China, the population giant of the world, implemented powerful measures for population control in 1979. The general rule of 1 child per married couple has been encouraged ever since, based on the slogan of late marriage, late childbirth, few births, and outstanding upbringing. The government has strongly promoted this drastic 1-child policy. Incentives are provided to parents for their first child, covering all expenses for childbirth, medical treatment, and childcare facilities, as well as milk supplies, which are provided monthly at no charge. On the other hand, the family must assume responsibility for all costs if they have a second child, and furthermore, all expenses that had been provided earlier for the first child must also be repaid to the government. In light of the ever-increasing cost of education and the hope for fulfillment in their own personal lives, it can be said that the one-child policy has essentially become established among parents residing in urban areas. However, even though this population control policy is the most stringent and without par anywhere in the world, the population still continues to climb by about 14 million every year, exceeding the 1.2 billion mark in 1995. Behind this population increase is a deeply rooted traditional value system, which still persists in the agricultural villages, that associates a large family and prosperity and stresses the importance of men while discounting the value of women. The government also recognizes the birth of a second child after a few years have passed when the firstborn is a girl. In addition, since the adoption of the agricultural output quota system, which allows families with more workers to take over the cultivation of more land, thereby increasing their earnings, 2 children have become the norm among rural families. The present total fertility rate of 1.89, however, can be considered a major success of the one-child policy. This is a medium variant projection of the increase in the world's population until the year 2150. The population is expected to surge in the 21st century, in particular in Africa and Asia. Though Africa does indeed demonstrate a high rate of increase, it is clear that this is much more highly pronounced in Asia. A question of central importance that must be answered is the ability of Asia to produce enough food to support this massive population. All nations in Asia half a century ago suffered from an acute shortage of food. In Japan, too, there were not that many who were able to eat 3 meals a day. In the late 1960s, we see the beginnings of a significant increase in rice production, especially in Southeast Asia. Newly developed high-yield varieties of rice plants made this great increase in production possible. These new varieties could be harvested in half of the time, and besides that, depending on the area, 2 or 3 harvests a year became a possibility, since there was no limit in the growing season of these varieties. Achieving this high yield, however, required exhaustive control of water resources, together with vast quantities of chemical fertilizers and agricultural chemicals. This shows the quantities of chemical fertilizers used in the major nations of Asia. Among them, China, India, Japan, and Indonesia in particular use astonishing quantities. In order to realize appropriate control of water resources, massive investments have been poured into dams and water supply and irrigation facilities. This shows the irrigation rate in various regions around the world. It is possible to see that Asia is the most advanced region in this respect. The nations of Asia have thus attained self-sufficiency in their grain supplies through high-yield varieties of rice and wheat, chemical fertilizers, agricultural chemicals, and irrigation facilities. This phenomenon is known as the Green Revolution. This indicates the rate of self-sufficiency in edible grains in the major nations of Asia. Most of them had attained a level essentially of 100% self-sufficiency by 1985. India, Thailand, Pakistan, and other nations have also increased their supplies in storage and have even developed export capability. This can be considered a major outcome of the Green Revolution. The question remains, though, have food supplies really become that abundant? This indicates the caloric intake, which is one index for measuring the quality of the diet, in regions around the world. It can be seen from this that, in North America, Europe, Russia, and Oceania, about half of this intake is derived from animal protein. In contrast, the people of Asia, Africa, and Central and South America derive the same from grain products. Even in Asia, though, they have embarked on the road to industrialization, seeking a more prosperous way of life, after having once achieved self-sufficiency in grain production during the 1980s. Economic growth continues in most of these countries, and the diet has also been going through a steady change to the Western-style meat-centered diet. Economic growth in Asia based on industrialization has boosted personal incomes and has accelerated the demand for meat, dairy products, and eggs. The production of foodstuffs based on animal protein, however, consumes enormous quantities of grain. During a 4-year period beginning in 1990, China increased its grain production by 36 million tons, just for use in the production of pork alone. In the light of the total 30 million tons of grain that are imported into Japan every year, grain consumption of this magnitude in China, therefore, should be viewed with astonishment. As this example from China demonstrates, massive quantities of grain are required in the production of meat products. For instance, 2 kilograms of grain are needed to produce 1 kilogram of poultry. Likewise, 4 and 7 kilograms of grain are required to produce the same 1 kilogram of meat in the case of pork and beef, respectively. Dr. Lester R. Brown, director of the U.S. organization World Watch Institute, offered this stark prediction. China will need to import 400 million tons of grain by the year 2030 in order to be able to enjoy the same quality diet as Taiwan does today. Total world grain exports in 1993 amounted to 200 million tons, and presently, there is no country anywhere in the world capable of exporting 400 million tons of grain to China. There is also no means available to use for increasing food production. Even if China were able to get by with half that amount, that is, 200 million tons, the entire world would be thrown into a major food crisis. The impossibility of realizing a broad increase in food production hereafter becomes clearly evident when we review the transitions in food production over the last decade or so. One reason for this is the fact that the chemical fertilizers and agricultural chemicals that were largely responsible for the dramatic increases in yields at the time of the Green Revolution have now reached the limits of their effectiveness. In Japan, there was a succession of incidents resulting in damage to human health caused by the massive introduction of chemical fertilizers, especially agricultural chemicals, from about 1965 through the 1970s. There were frequent occurrences of skin diseases and liver function disorders, as well as strange and incurable illnesses with no known methods of treatment. Insects, shellfish, fish, and small animals that lived in rice paddies were decimated, and even the birds disappeared. Furthermore, these chemicals also exerted a serious impact on the environment, resulting in the pollution of rivers, erosion, salt damage, and deterioration of agricultural soil. There is no hope of any further increase in production through the use of chemical fertilizers and agricultural chemicals. The second reason why we cannot anticipate increased food production is the ever-shrinking area of arable land. Tracts of fertile agricultural land are being eliminated one after the other due to roadway and residential construction, expansion of ports and other activities, together with the expansion of industrialization. In Japan, 824,000 hectares, or 13.3% of the total agricultural land, were lost during the 30-year period beginning in 1960. By 1993, it became necessary to import 77% of total grain consumption. There has also been a conspicuous depletion of arable land in China. This illustrates the transitions in this reduction since the 1980s. By the 1980s, an average of 300,000 hectares of land was lost every year, altogether reaching a total of 3.73 million hectares. This trend continued during the 1990s, and by 1994, some 570,000 hectares of farmland had been converted to industrial sites, leisure facilities, aquaculture ponds, and so forth. Moreover, 80% of the reduction in arable land has taken place in the fertile granary area, blessed with abundant water resources south of the Changjiang River. In addition to this, rice production reached a peak in 1992 and has been declining yearly ever since. The third reason for the inability to increase food production is the lack of water supplies for agricultural use. No fewer than 1,000 tons of water are required to produce a single ton of grain. Most of this water is drawn from rivers and lakes. Rapid increases in population and the process of urbanization lead to the consumption of excessive volumes of water and, for example, food production has been discontinued in some areas in the Ganges River Basin in South Asia due to the shortage of water. There are also some areas, such as along the west coast of India, that have been rendered useless for food production because aquifers have been contaminated by salt due to excessive pumping of water for irrigation. Water shortages have thus become a serious problem all over the world. This, in effect, marks the end of irrigated agriculture. The fourth reason for a lack of hope for increased food production is the reduction of marine resources. The worldwide fish catch in 1950 amounted to an average of 9 kilograms per person. By 1990, this had increased to 19 kilograms. Most oceanographers point out that this catch has already surpassed the limit. Actually, overfishing is already widespread in 9 of the 17 major fishing grounds around the world, and catches have begun to shrink. If indiscriminate overfishing practices continue, there is a risk of completely depleting marine sources in the 21st century. The fifth reason why food production cannot be increased is the dampened expectations in the field of biotechnology. Though field testing continues with the genetic alteration of field crops, fish, and livestock, there is no clear prospect for a sound increase in food production. Thus, increased food production capable of supporting future population increases is fraught with extreme uncertainty. If the situation continues as it is, struggles for the possession of limited resources could aggravate tension, with the added risk of possibly causing confrontations and disputes between regions. Producing your own food within your own area has been the way of life since the ancient past. This practice continued on for centuries in all areas of the world. What is the present situation, though? In regions with extreme progress in industrialization, the lifestyle reflects a shift characterized by the importation of a wide diversity of foodstuffs from around the world, made possible by profits gained from the export of industrial goods. Japan and Singapore are typical examples of this in Asia. Population in these countries is concentrated in the cities, and there is no one left to take over the job of food production. In Japan, a mere 4.81% of the total workforce is actually engaged in the production of food as agricultural workers. As industrialization advances, agricultural products come to be treated as merchandise, just as in industry. In other words, the highest priority is now given to the best means of generating profits. Agreement was also reached in agricultural negotiations during GATT talks that essentially uphold this concept. Agricultural products are no longer meant to satisfy hunger and maintain health. The main concern is how to go about making a profit. For example, even in China, after the introduction of a market economy, fields that had previously been used for the production of rice were immediately converted to fruit orchards, as soon as they realized that they could make more money by growing fruit than growing rice. If they could even make more money by raising eels instead of growing fruit, they would immediately convert their fields to ponds for that purpose. Thailand is one of the largest exporters of rice in the world. However, with the expansion of industrialization and the changes in the social economy, they have been vigorously switching to the cultivation of corn, cassava, sugarcane, sorghum, and other agricultural products that will bring greater profits as exports. In addition, there has also been extensive growth in industries that export cultivated shrimp and chicken broilers as processed foods. Because of that, mangrove swamps in the tidal flats along the coast are being converted one after the other to shrimp cultivation ponds. Farmers in the past grew agricultural crops that matched the climate and natural features of the area. The emphasis now, however, is on the artificial production of crops that are suitable for the market rather than the area. And besides that, the same crop is grown time after time in the same field. The price of agricultural produce is controlled to a great extent by the weather. In the free market, a bumper crop can cause prices to collapse, thereby affecting the well-being of the producing country and the producers themselves. A poor harvest, on the other hand, can lead to skyrocketing prices, thereby incurring inflation and, among countries incapable of importing, possibly inducing starvation and poverty and kindling social unrest. It seems that people in all areas around the world are single-minded in their pursuit of profits. It is said that we will be able to overcome the problems of food shortages and starvation by merely maintaining a market economy and free trade. We must ask, however, if this assertion is really true. Agricultural produce is not merely merchandise. It is the staff of life essential in nurturing our well-being. It is necessary for us to produce our own food and take responsibility in securing our own food supply. There is also a need to maintain and strengthen fair international trade. The US, EU, Oceania, and other food exporters are all moving toward the establishment of a system for unrestricted competition in agricultural products, allowing for no exceptions. There is the risk, however, that competition in the export of agricultural products may not only invite the collapse of agriculture in the importing country, but could also upset the very foundation of agriculture in the exporting country. According to a survey by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, there are 786 million people around the world who today are suffering from malnutrition. Moreover, although the population will continue to expand further hereafter, there is no hope for an increase in the production of food to support this increase. The prosperous, developed industrialized nations, on the other hand, use their financial means to more or less monopolize food resources, and have no qualms about indulging themselves in eating as much as they please. Currently, the rich nations, which comprise a mere 23% of the nations of the world, consume 83% of available resources. The developed industrial nations are faced with the need to refrain from unchecked gluttony and waste. The developing nations, too, must adopt stiff measures for population control. Specific measures should include the promotion and implementation of reproductive health and rights which encourage education for women and seek to improve their social status. Women who live in poverty are caught up in a vicious cycle characterized by a lack of knowledge and information, repeated childbirth, the inability to educate their children, the lack of employment opportunities, and early marriage. Every effort must be made to bring this vicious cycle to a decisive end. A proposal was presented at the International Conference of Parliamentarians on Population and Development, held in Cairo in 1994, to divert funds from the world's current military budget of more than $10 trillion for use in ODA activities. Total ODA funding amounts to no more than a mere 0.5% of current military spending, and of that, only 1 or 2% is presently earmarked for population and family planning activities. Cannons will result in neither peace nor love. The political leaders of the world are challenged to show the courage and resolve to rechannel the immense budget for use in bolstering population